Alright, I know it's early, but I just finished a final. I have another one in a few hours, so I might as well get this done now. So, today I shall talk about a critique of James K. Polk's policies. Now, you might notice something a bit different about this one, and that is that I have pre-drawn a few things. One, because I am not that good at drawing, so getting it out of the way solves that problem first. And two, I doubt most people know who James K. Polk is. Now, I would hope a lot of Americans know who he is, but I'm not confident in that, and relying on it to judge his policies isn't a very good idea. So, I've drawn some important territories for his policies. Let's start off with when he was president. He was president in the 1840s, only did one term, and he made a few campaign promises. Let's list a few. 1. Texas would be annexed. Now, the Republic of Texas was independent for a while, but it did not join the Union until Polk's presidency. And it's also worth noting it had a lot of claims that it didn't control. In fact, if I can draw right here, this is the general area that was pretty much fully under Texas sovereignty and control. Over here was a bunch of land that they claimed despite not actually ruling it. And so you can start to see where the rest of this comes in, because 2, he said he was going to acquire California. Now, specifically Alta California. For those who don't know, and I included it here, California was broken into 2 administrations, Alta and Baja. So Alta y Baja were the official regions of California as far as Mexico is concerned, and Polk said, we're going to get California in reference to the northern territories of it, Upper California. He also promised to settle the Oregon dispute, and by settle, he means he wanted the Oregon Territory. What happened here was that both the United States and the United Kingdom claimed a joint territory called the Oregon Territory, which makes up modern-day British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And basically what was going on is, while the U.S. had settlers flooding in, especially after the Oregon Trail was mapped, what the British were doing there was both trade and dealing with their naval situation, because, as one might be able to guess, a port in the northern Pacific is important for the UK, especially during the 1800s, where, if you don't know, the UK was rapidly expanding its holdings in the Pacific. You got the further colonization of Australia in the south, its expansions into British Malaya, you've got the Opium Wars with China, and you got an increasing worry about Russia, so naturally, Pacific ports are going to be very important for the UK. So Polk promised to settle the dispute and gain land for the United States that'd be indisputably under American supervision, as opposed to the current situation at his presidency, which was a joint occupation without actually having anyone controlling either part. He also said he was going to lower tariffs for profitability. The logic being that if tariffs are, say, here, then less people are going to buy. So if you lower them a bit to, say, this point, let's say you lower them by 5%, then the increasing imports and exports would result in greater revenue for the federal government, thus lower tariffs would allow for greater profitability. It's the same basis that we do with a lot of taxation, of the idea of if you lower taxes a bit, you make more money in the long run because of increased growth. Same principle with the tariffs. So Polk got elected. What did he do? 1, first thing he did, annex Texas. He made an offer to buy California from Mexico, but Mexico refused. So he started the Mexican-American War by stationing troops around here. Not exactly there, but in this general area near the Rio Grande. And as a result, when Mexico came up and said, hey, you're not supposed to be here, this is our territory, well, the U.S. troops said no, fighting broke out, and the U.S. declared war on Mexico. And thus the Mexican-American War began. He was also able to, during this time, pass through Congress a resolution that lowered tariffs and thus achieved that part of his goal. And following occupation of Mexico City, the United States was able to sign a treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which resulted in all of this territory going to the United States, except here. This would be acquired later through the Gadsden Purchase, which was sold by one Santa Anna. Yeah, the dude was freaking everywhere in Mexican politics. It's like you couldn't get rid of him. It's also worth noting, the United States dominated Mexico in this war, and I don't mean that as an insult to Mexico. The U.S. just crushed them. I mean, Mexican capital was occupied, all of the claimed territories were under U.S. control, and they were starting to push into the rest of Mexico. The U.S. could have taken more. In fact, a lot of people wanted to take more, but a lot of people also didn't, and the diplomat they sent to negotiate in the end was a anti-war diplomat, so he only took this. In fact, if you learn about several Civil War generals, you'll learn that the Mexican War was a bit more controversial in terms of how people viewed it. Because a lot of people, especially in the North, saw it as expanding Southern interests. But to help Northern interests, Oregon. Now, Polk he would have taken the whole thing. 46-40 or fight was the mentality at the time for a lot of people, and it was the idea of basically either we take it all or we go to war. But let's face it, that would be impractical on both ends. Not only was Britain dealing with other things at the time, but the United States was a smaller country. It would not have been a good time to go to war. So, despite Polk likely wanting to and being willing to take, if he could, all of Oregon, he instead negotiated and we get the Oregon Treaty, which sees modern-day Idaho, Washington, and Oregon ceded to the United States, and what is now British Columbia, going to the UK and British North America. And so, in his 4-year term, James K. Polk accomplished every single policy of his, including acquiring territory which would eventually become the new states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, California, forgive me for the bad drawing of California, Nevada, Utah. As one can observe, I am not the best at drawing. Yeah, this is supposed to be Utah. As observed, I suck at it. Colorado, modern-day Texas, and numerous other territories, including New Mexico and Arizona. Again, observe, I am not good at drawing. In fact, I'm pretty sure Nevada's border would be a bit closer to here. But still, nevertheless, point made. He had a lot of territory to the U.S., and I'd say the biggest thing when it comes to looking at his policies is the fact that he achieved everything he set out to do. Now, there are plenty of people who would argue that he did not do good things because he furthered American expansion and manifest destiny. But he did live up to his promises. Little Hickery, who was, in fact, actually following in the footsteps of Andrew Jackson, lived up to every single promise he made in one term, did not run for office later, and just retired. He did all of this in 4 years. There are presidents who've done less in 2. And it should be stressed how important these acquisitions were. Texas, obviously, big oil state now. That's a big one. But California, in particular, was, in my opinion, the big win here. Now, a lot of us, on the right especially, tend to like to make fun of California for its modern issues. Here's the thing. California is one of the most strategically important places in the Americas. Now, say what you will about the modern policies, but take that out. Let's just look at what it naturally has as benefits. 1. It's on the Pacific Ocean. Already that's a massive boon because this is the time of trade across long distances, and the Pacific is going to become one of the big highways and thoroughfares for a lot of that trade. You get a lot of trade with China, a lot of trade with Japan, a lot of colonization of just Asia in general, which means the Pacific becomes even more important. And so having a port there, without having to go through anyone, is very valuable for American traders, especially once the Intercontinental Railroad is later built, but that'll take several decades, because it'll mean goods from over here can be shipped out to the Pacific and then reach a good place to sell them, say China, in a few weeks to months. That is a very big deal when it comes to trade. California is also very minerally wealthy. They have a lot of gold and a lot of other precious metals and valuable resources. And although people don't talk about this much, they also have oil. So, yeah, very, very valuable, especially with what's coming up. Because the Industrial Revolution is still kicking in and it's still going full force. So yeah, ignoring the bad drawing, getting California was of massive geopolitical importance to the United States. And a lot of people like to bring up its GDP now as a justification for that, but the only reason its GDP went up as it did was because of its interaction with the rest of the United States. And the same is true in reverse. The reason Texas and other states are as rich as they are is because when they want to sell things to the Pacific, they could have done it through California, and they still do in partial extent. California also can grow a lot of crops. In fact, quite a lot of our agricultural products come from California outside of the Midwest. Okay, then what about Oregon, the Oregon Territory? Well, for one, although less valuable than California, Washington is still a very valuable place, especially in terms of trade. Not to mention there's a lot of wood there, so logging, which is a very important industry at the time, was still massively growing because of it. Then there's the fact that gold was found pretty much throughout the entire Rocky Mountains. Even going into Alaska, there was a lot of gold. And so naturally, in gold-based economies running off of literal gold standard backing, everything was worth its weight in gold. And having more territory along this very valuable mountain range, which seems to have a lot of gold near it, was massively beneficial. Also, just adds to the fact that the United States is bigger, which, while that may be a weird thing to point out, is important for a lot of countries during this time because, yeah, it looks better on a map. It makes you more prestigious. This was a time where the idea of having more land means more prestigious was a big deal. It's why we don't just see Russia selling Alaska immediately. They only sold it once they thought, oh, we can't secure this from Britain, so let's get it off our hands. Because before then, even if it didn't carry much monetary value because the otters were going extinct, it still made their empire look better because they ruled Alaska, and so they kept it. And so the US's prestige massively increased thanks to Polk, especially because the US's defeat of Mexico demonstrated that it was capable of fighting decently sized powers and not just small bands of Indian tribes. However, it is worth acknowledging, to some extent, that Polk did sort of set the U.S. further on the path to civil war. Now, to be fair, the Civil War was likely coming regardless. The moment slavery was not going to be abolished peacefully, aka the moment cotton was invented, is the moment you have a guarantee of a civil war of some kind. Of what scale? That depends on the country and who gets in charge. But the very pro-Southern policies of Jackson, coupled with Polk's expansion, meant that the United States was not only heading to civil war, but likely heading to a bloody and not as lopsided one. because the South was growing economically. Its military was being invested in more than the North's. So while the North could call up a lot of troops, absolutely, the South was still ahead initially. And in particular, expansion west became a massive issue of contention. For those who don't know, there was a proviso, I believe the Wilmot Proviso was the name, and what it did was it said that we should ban all slavery in the Western territories, all the territories we got out of the Mexican Cession and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, basically the same thing. And needless to say, this caused a massive influx of basically Southern anger. Because in the South's mind, it was basically the North saying, nope, you can't go past this line. But the North can, and so it would further and further outpopulate them until eventually the South would be forced to abolish slavery anyways, which, given their planters were not having that, meant that the South was going to basically say, yep, nope, none of that. Stuff like the Wilmot Proviso basically guaranteed that the South would not take any action to restrain slavery as anything other than an act to ban slavery inevitably. And sure, that's what it would do. But they were not having that, and they weren't interested in that, so, well, Civil War. Only 13 years from Polk's retirement, the Civil War broke out. That is how close they are. And without question, Polk's policies, while they were a massive boon to the U.S. and still contribute greatly to it, did set the stage for what would inevitably become the Civil War. Sure, Buchanan was the one who fumbled handling the situation once it finally came up, but in the end, the moment the Western territories were acquired, the slavery issue became even more important. And the Compromise of 1850 didn't really solve anything. Because sure, it said, hey, California can join as a free state, and we're going to allow you to make some slave raids up north to try to recapture escaped slaves, even though they would just take free men. But because of the clear outpopulation the North was having and continuing to have, alongside the fact that more free states, Oregon, Washington, and California, sorry I flipped them, were joining the Union, it was very evident that the South had no way out if it wanted to keep slavery other than secession. And thus, the Western territories basically guaranteed secession. Because sure, if it's isolated over here, let's say they just took Texas, okay, that can work, and you just hold it. Sure, northern outpopulation is still a concern, but with the states and the Senate, it's less of a problem. However, with all this new land available, and with northerners in particular flooding there, well, guess what? You're going to end up with the North winning in terms of Senate seats as well, not just House seats. And that was a very big concern. It's why later things like Bleeding Kansas even happened. Because if you're worried about 2 Senate seats, when it's very clear the North has the advantage, the South's going to get even more aggressive, and so the North's going to get even more aggressive in response. Essentially, what Polk did, in my opinion, was good. He annexed Texas, gained large swaths of territory for the U.S. in both California and the Oregon Territory, and he lowered tariffs. He was a good president. It's just his policies set the stage for what would eventually become the Civil War, and accelerated it by essentially throwing a giant cacophony of territories and noises into the political sphere. Because, well, guess what? All those people in California, they now want to get their own votes, become their own state. And people, especially those in favor of the South, aren't having it because the Californians are trying to become a free state, a northern ally. Meanwhile, what they would hoped to happen, these states becoming states and joining for the South as slave states was unlikely due to geography and the fact that, let's face it, they're deserts. There's a desert here. Good luck getting a lot of people there, especially in a timely manner. Meanwhile, guess what the North got? Place where you can grow crops and is fairly temperate. Same here, same here. In fact, this is more tropical than, if anything, in the South. Like, these are the territories that people really wanted during that time, and they all went to the North. So while it was basically an acceleration towards civil war, it was still a benefit all around. My main conclusion is that, as stated earlier, Polk's policies were good. We should keep in mind, again, that he did accelerate the Civil War, but as far as I'm concerned, Civil War was inevitable the moment the cotton gin was invented. The moment the South saw slavery as a massive, profitable enterprise is the moment that its planters would fight tooth and nail to preserve it. If one disagrees and believes that Civil War wasn't inevitable and that some method would somehow avoid it, other than, just crushing it outright, well, then this is probably a bigger negative than anything else. Because without question, Polk did accelerate a lot of things. But that'll be all. Thank you for watching.